Good evening, and welcome to the set of forums on human diversity and social order. These are one part of the 150th birthday celebration of MIT. Indeed, MIT was chartered in 1861, the very first year of the Civil War, which gave all the diverse folk in the US a formally equal chance to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our late colleague, the metallurgist Cyril Smith, compared the development of human communities to the freezing of a metal melt. As the temperature of the melt decreases, beautiful, distinct crystals form in random locations with random orientations, and as they grow, some of their edges combine in harmonious patterns, and others clash in rough zones of interaction. Similarly, when diverse human communities come into contact, their cultures, their languages, their arts, and their music are enriched, even as they struggle to find patterns of social order. Today, we celebrate the fruits of diversity. In the next two sessions, on February 17 and 24, we will describe the struggles which underlie the definition and the construction of a still imperfect social order on the world stage and in the US. And finally, on March 17, we will examine how MIT and other research universities go about developing a framework to support a community of diverse students, staff, and faculty. That is our general program, and let us now begin. My colleague, Professor Wesley Harris, will introduce the chair of this meeting.
Good evening, friends. The previous speaker is my partner in crime, Professor Leon Trilling, the architect of this design, and I'm very, very pleased to be a partner with him in it. I have a very easy job, one which I enjoy. That is to introduce the chair of this particular forum. I've had the distinct pleasure of working alongside Dean Adèle Santos for 3 years as a member of Academic Council. So I forewarn the panelists. She can drive randomness out of any herd. So guys, be warned. She has a hook that is very, very effective. Adèle is an architect, an urban designer. She's also a principal in Santos and Prescott in San Francisco. She has a rich history within the academy, having left superior marks at the University of Berkeley, Harvard, Rice, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of California in San Diego. There's not much in the program about Adèle, but she comes to MIT and has presented herself and has enriched us in many ways. It's my pleasure to ask Adèle to help us through, direct us through the rest of the program. Adèle?
Thank you, Wes. Could we ask for these lights to be lowered a little bit? We find ourselves squinting. That's better, thank you very much. So the order of business this evening is that we've got 3 wonderful speakers who've never met each other before until about half an hour ago. And, right, hi guys. And I will just briefly kind of elaborate a little bit on who I am and what I believe in. And then I will introduce the three of them pretty briefly. And then in order, we'll have Elliot Bosworth Davis, and then we'll have Walter Hood, and then we'll have Donal Fox. And after that, I'll ask them to speak to each other, ask questions briefly, and then open it to the audience. So just to begin, a confession. I grew up in South Africa during the era of apartheid. There were few fruits of diversity, of course. Actually, if there were any, they were illegal. We had been a nation with a very rich cultural mix of indigenous people and waves of settlers who'd come from around the world and had settled in this beautiful land until apartheid became the law. After that, we lived in a society divided by skin color, but it's much more complicated than that. There were subdivisions within this, by ethnicity, by culture, by language, and religion. For example, if you were colored, a product of mixed race, you might have a white skin and blue eyes, but there was a dark grandmother somewhere back there. White fathers who actually were married before the rule of apartheid to women who were other could not actually even meet their children because there was no place to go. You couldn't eat in a restaurant together. You couldn't wander through a park together because the benches were all labeled. And if you were Asian, and you were Chinese, you were considered to be non-white. But if you were Japanese, you were white because of trade with Japan. So we were classified, we were labeled, we were parceled into residential districts. Our neighborhood was racially mixed when I was born, and one day the nice Indian family who lived above the convenience store was gone, as were many others, and so was the store. So cleaning up the map that was arbitrarily drawn by the government was truly draconian. Large swaths of Cape Town, such as the famous District 6, were demolished, leaving a few deserted mosques in a barren landscape. This had been the focal area of the colored community where jazz clubs flourished. The musicians who could migrated to Amsterdam, Stockholm, and elsewhere, and this creative culture died right like that. Living in a society where people were separated by artificial boundaries led inevitably to a fearful, sterile, intellectual environment. And once you start this game, everything gets parceled. Women's work, girls were meant to go and be nurses and caregivers. And men, they had the whole world. I had the misfortune to choose a male profession, architecture. My father said, go to London, it's better for you. But fast forward, here I am at MIT, and not surprisingly, I believe quite passionately in a world of inclusiveness. The fruits of diversity become possible when boundaries are dissolved, be these by intellectual discipline, by gender, by race, by ethnicity, or by culture. Once we open the doors, the potential for exchange of knowledge is enlarged and personal growth is encouraged. The wonder of MIT is the permeability of our disciplines, the possibility for collaboration, and the relative transparency of who we are and what we do. There's an enormous creative, inventive place where boundaries are crossed every day. We believe that we can invent the future, and we creatively do. We like to say that we are committed to a healthy diversity, and I believe this to be true. It's not easy all the time. We believe in gender equity too, and we attempt to have frank discussions about the fruits of diversity writ large, as this evening, not just racial, but in many other ways. And events like these, I think, are really important for us to enjoy each other and to celebrate our collective humanity. So that's where I come from in this talk. And so the first speaker, Elliot Boswick Davis, is the John Moores Cabot Chair of the Art of the Americas Department at the MFA. She was the lead curator in planning and installing the museum's new wing of the Art of the Americas, which offers a broad definition of American art, including more than 5,000 works from North, Central, and South America. She also oversees the collection in the museum of about 15,000 works, which include painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. For those of you who have not been to the new museum wing, the juxtaposition of these works is quite different, really compelling, and is a whole new kind of definition of how we view the whole idea of art in this context. Before the MFA, she worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she was responsible for the Department of Drawings and Prints, and later joined the American Paintings and Sculpture Department. She received many degrees, an MA, an MPhil, and a PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia University. She also has another master's degree from New York University, and she graduated from Princeton from the Department of Art History and Archaeology. So welcome. Walter Hood, sitting in the middle there, is a professor and former chair of landscape architecture at UC Berkeley, the College of Environmental Design. He and I were colleagues there before I came to MIT. He's also a principal of Hood Design, which is a practice of landscape architecture, art, community, and urban design planning and research. There's something wonderful that is said of him. He's been praised as a community whisperer, where he creates spaces that have elements the residents want before they even know it. How do you do that, Walter? He's integrated architectural features such as playgrounds, plazas, and squares into city sites that have kind of fallen into disrepair, although they might have had vibrant histories. He works very closely with local communities and has developed solutions for Bay Area parks that are quite startling. He's also designed landscapes for high-profile commissions, such as the De Young Museum in San Francisco. I don't know if he's going to show this, but he won a public art competition to design 1.1 megawatt solar array for the University of Buffalo campus, which is being built by the New York Power Authority. And he has master's degrees in architecture and landscape architecture from UC Berkeley. He recently finished his studies for an MFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago, which has really influenced his practice in very interesting ways. His publications include Everyday Urbanism, Urban Diaries, Improvisation in West Oakland, and another book called Blues and Jazz Landscape Improvisations, and I think he and Donal will have something to say to each other. He went to the American Academy in Rome as a fellow. He was the recipient of the prestigious Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape Architecture. And he is actually he's our first Robert Taylor Fellow in Architecture, in memory of the first Black graduate of MIT who happened to be in architecture. And so, welcome, Walter. Sorry, guys, this is a bit long, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of thoughts. And then we have Donal Leonellis Fox. Donal Fox is internationally acclaimed as a composer, pianist, and improviser in both jazz and classical music. His numerous awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship in Music Composition and a fellowship from the Bogliasco Foundation. I don't know where that is. He served as... Really? Is that what it is? Okay, he served as the first African-American composer in residence with the St. Louis Symphony. He was a visiting artist at Harvard University. He's recently premiered his Monk and Bach concert project at Lincoln Center. His orchestra piece, Here the Lambs Are Crying, commissioned by the Albany Symphony Orchestra for the Spiritual Project, his Scarlatti Jazz Suite project at the Azara Concert Hall in Tanglewood, and the world premiere of his piano concerto, Peace Out, for the improvised piano and orchestra at Carnegie Hall with the American Composers Orchestra, all fairly recent. I could go on and on here. He has, let me see, his innovative jazz duet series has included concerts, recordings, and collaborations with many musicians of note. He's recorded as a composer and pianist for the New World Records, Evidence Records, Music and Arts, Pass Through Records, Yamaha's Original Artist Series, and Wergo Records. He's recently a recipient of a prestigious American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Music, and he's right now here at MIT as a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar. So let me see, I think that's enough on all of you. And now you can tell us what you think. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, there it is, actually.
So to begin, for those of you who have visited the Art of the Americas, and for those of you who haven't, I thought we would begin by talking a little bit about what we mean at the Museum of Fine Arts by the art of the Americas. And we do mean the art of North, Central, and South America, extending as far back as 900 BC. And you see our Olmec mask there at the far left, the oldest object in our care. And we extend in the wing as far forward as the third quarter of the 20th century, although with Native American art into the present decade for contemporary work. And as the wing evolves, we'll certainly show art from the more recent decades. And I'm just showing here, we're going to return to it, but Norman Lewis's Untitled, new acquisition. This is a work from 1964, and David Smith's Cubi there at the far right. Of course, artists from the United States have been visiting South America for many generations. And for those often familiar with our artists that are well known at the MFA, at the top there, Frederick Church, visiting Cayambe, and Martin Johnson Heat at the upper right, visiting South America as well in the late 19th century, so just after MIT's founding in the 1880s at the left and 1870s at the right. But of course, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were here from the very beginning, and we do include in our collections the art of the Acoma peoples at the far left, 1880s, rediscovered in the early 20th century by photographer Edward Curtis, and you see him there in his photograph with at the old Acoma well there on the right from the early 1900s. So in fulfilling this mandate, I came to the museum, as Adèle described. Thank you for that very wonderful, lengthy introduction. But my mandate was to fulfill this directive of being the art of the Americas. And to do that, we had to, of course, fill out the collection in lots of different ways. These are a group of many of the new acquisitions that you'll see there in the wing. They come from Central and South America. Objects such as the upper left, you'll see a Jaguar vessel there. I don't want to blind any of you, so maybe I'm going to step out a little bit if that's all right, because I just don't want to take my watch. Here, from about 700 AD, Tirona figures from Central America. And we extend as far forward in the 20th century, artists like Wilfredo Lam working in Cuba and the Caribbean, but combining many different cultures in his work, this one Untitled of 1943. And an artist, probably not so well known to many of you, but living artist Cesar Paternoster from Argentina, here working out of his knowledge of ancient American textiles, his exposure to the work of Joseph Albers, who showed in Buenos Aires in the 1960s. This work is based on musical form. It's called Staccato from 1965. And the color harmonies there, but also the way that it's almost as big as you see on that screen. He's working through many threads here in his work. We also include in the art of the Americas the art of the Native Americans, and we are not as strong in this area as we might hope, although our founders from the beginning had included the works of artists throughout the globe, including the indigenous peoples of ancient and Native America. We are, for instance, not that strong in art from our own region here in New England, but we've recently acquired Woodland's work like this 19th century sash worn in New England. And we've acquired Southwestern jewelry, these works from the 19th century, and more contemporary objects, all these three across the top, many in media that artists Native American artists did not traditionally work in, such as this glass work from the West Coast by Preston Singletary, a work of 2002, or this oil painting by Canadian artist Rick Rivette. But we also wanted to include the longer arc in the wing of 20th century artists and working in the United States, like Steve Wheeler. He defied really any definition at all. He was often loosely associated with the Indian space painters, but he combined all kinds of iconography from native and ancient peoples. This work of 1943, Man Menacing Woman. We also wanted to tell the story of New Spain, and this would be our foothold into some of the colonial threads that we could begin to draw out from New Spain. New acquisitions such as these, the portrait of the Archbishop of Mexico, painted by the foremost painter of Mexico, Miguel Cabrera, in 1754, is really an exact counterpart in New Spain to the many strengths in Copley that we have of the mid-18th century produced here in New England. The museum had fine 17th century table covers, textiles like these, but of course the New World and the discovery of the New World brought with it the introduction of new drinks like chocolate, cacao, well known to the ancient Americans, here shown in an 18th century silver vessel. And I just point out that this writing desk, one of the finest pieces of furniture known to have come out of Mexico. It's on view in the Spanish Colonial Gallery in the wing, and it's just come to the museum this June. Much harder for us is to tell the story of Canada, our neighbors to the north, for a variety of reasons, many of them having to do with the tax code of these two nations and the fact that Canadians cannot freely make gifts to our museum without really being true philanthropists. So we've been able to make some inroads in terms of acquisitions, but not as rapidly as we would like. We do have some examples of furniture by many of our Canadian artists, and we like to claim Philip Guston, who worked here in Boston. He was born in Montreal, so we'll include him there as well. You'll see in the wing a much broader spectrum of the different kinds of artists, in addition to the geography that we've been covering just a moment ago. More works by women artists than before. Most of these new acquisitions, but familiar favorites like Gretchen Rogers' self-portrait in a fur hat, she being one of the representatives of the Boston School that flourished here at the School of the Museum, our affiliate also founded along with us in 1870. And you see many artists working in the areas they were encouraged to be in, such as jewelry making, Claire Falkenstein, pottery making. These are works by Saturday Evening Girls produced here in Boston during the arts and crafts period, or tapestries. But of course, easel paintings as well. This is Lois Mallow-Jones, My Mother's Hats. She, an African-American woman and also graduate of our School of the Museum. Also, folk artists. These are the often unknown or not often really well represented in the mainstream of art history. Artists that are very interesting in and of themselves. Artists like Rufus Porter, in many ways the 19th century US counterpart to the Renaissance man, in the sense that he was a complete autodidact. He briefly had some training at a military academy in Maine, but soon found that he was off on his own, traveling around the country as far west as Hawaii, painting in exchange for room and board. This work from about 1820 was on the wall of a tavern, so it's actually bigger than what you see there. But for Rufus Porter, many of you probably know his Scientific American that he founded, but he also was the inventor of many forward-thinking devices, the locomotive, the revolving rifle, whose patent he sold to Colt. It's known as the Colt revolver. But this is how he chose to paint. So he runs counter to type as what most people think of as folk artists, in that this is how he chose to paint. And taught others to do it. We also have works by Dave, he's known as Dave the Potter. This is a monumental vessel. It's really an extraordinary example of pottery making in and of itself. But Dave was also a slave. His owner, Lewis Miles, L.M., was inscribed on this work. Dave was literate and included on all of his vessels, many of his vessels, his own poetry. This one says, I made this jar for cash, but it's called lucre trash. Harriet Powers, also a former slave, and she produced this really one of the high watermarks of American quilt making from 1895, based on imaginary scenes and also those she observed, such as this meteor shower in the middle. Many more works have been acquired throughout the last decade while we've been working on the wing. Of artists of color. We've had a grant to do this recently from the National Endowment of Humanities, which really underscores the work that's been ongoing. These are all new acquisitions that are on view in the wing, from the 19th century artists like Henry Ossawa Tanner and Grafton Tyler Brown here at the lower left, to a number of works of art that came from the collection of George and the late Joyce Ween. He, a great jazz musician here in Boston, an internationally known figure in the world of jazz. He and Joyce, who was a student at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, an African-American woman who knew many of these artists, collected a large group of works, and these are three that we were able to acquire, Courtois, Crite, and Barthé. But that allowed us the wedge in to get many others as time went on, so we were really grateful to George for helping us with that effort. Now, just to, moving away from what do we mean by Art of the Americas, I think you've seen this broad sweep. In the time that we had, I just want to show you a bit about the arc that we've traveled in creating this wing. When I arrived in 2001, our collections were very much divided by, according to media. This is a method that was very much in place here in the United States from the years when Charles Willson Peale, the naturalist, opened the first museum in Philadelphia in 1794. So here we have the paintings galleries devoted to Copley portraits, Boston Furniture Gallery, the corridor for American silver with many of the high points of silver makers like Revere and others working here in Boston. The plan, again, as I arrived, looked like this. The part that was built is here to the eastern side of the campus, looking here west towards MIT over in this direction. This part will not be built. It was permitted, but we've acquired the parcel of the Forsyth Institute. But more importantly, here is the blue that we'll be talking about, the Art of the Americas wing in this overview. And we had this slightly T-shaped building perimeter to deal with. But within that, and here you see it again, and I know I don't need to explain the directions of all these, we had 2 pavilions and a center core of galleries that looked like this when you looked into them, allowing us a central spine of galleries surrounded by other rooms and these 2 pavilions on 2 of the floors. As you cut it away, this is what we had. 4 floors that we arranged chronologically. As we were undergoing the planning, we heard that many people were quite intimidated when they come to museums of art. And to try to mitigate that, we felt that we would stack up each of the floors chronologically. So the foundation would become the earliest collections in our care, those of the indigenous peoples, ancient Native Americans, 17th century. The first level, this would be here. Here, 18th century, early 19th, 19th, and 20th. So as you rose through space, you proceeded through time. Now, as you're greeted on the foundation level, you're very much meant to feel as though you're in a place and time that you may not be so familiar with. You're greeted by these large, almost 4-foot-high quiche burial urns from about 750 AD, and they are meant to say that you are in the ancient Americas, and we hope you'll stay there. Look around. These are all very much in-process shots, harshly lit. These are all install views of the ancient Americas galleries going up, integrated with textiles as well. And you proceed from 2 galleries of ancient American art into 1 space devoted to Native American art, a collection still very much in formation. But here we show the work of ceramicists from the 19th century up to the 1980s. And on the end wall of this gallery, the story comes right up to the present. And here we include artists Native American artists who themselves define their work in a Native American tradition. And we did include a quote by one of the artists, Joan Quick-to-See Smith, because she observes that for many, for those in the contemporary art world, her work is not seen as being contemporary enough. But for those in the Native world, her work is not seen as being Native enough. So of course, back to the question of boundaries, these are artists that are constantly hovering and defining, but also being defined by these various preconceptions. Here I just show you some of the groupings where we do have depth in an area like the Plains Indians' work we can show there. We also in this wing had to incorporate, we made a decision to review all of our period rooms. These are very important to the historiography of museums in the United States for a lot of reasons. We didn't retain them all. We retained those that had the greatest integrity. And one, I think much to the surprise of our British architects who couldn't quite understand why we needed to preserve a room from 1690. We had the longest object to move into the building, this 49-foot beam from the Manning House in Ipswich, Mass. And it formed the summer beam. It sat in the building, as you can see it coming in here as the building was built around it, and it sat in its own little crate. And I asked the head of furniture conservation, I didn't quite understand why it had a peaked roof on the crate. So I asked Gordon, and he said, well, Elliot, if we didn't have the peaked roof, we would have a coffee bar throughout those months while the building was being built. So we ended up with the Manning beam. You'll have to look up to see it now. And moving up a level now into the Colonial Boston Gallery, here you see the objects all brought together. Your entryway on this floor is the Liberty Bowl created by Revere, who's shown here in the portrait by Copley, looking at an unengraved teapot. And the whole concept is that you get a sense for what these homes of the elite, many of them elite, although many of them were also sons of liberty and patriots, like Revere, shown here in his working sleeves as an artisan and working in precious metals as he did. But that is what this is intended to evoke for you through a variety of media, including schoolgirl needlework and these small slices, we call it, vignettes, of rooms like a Boston, corner of a Boston house that might have been in a home of some of the more elite members in Boston. And these are also the objects that came down to us through the years at the Museum of Fine Arts. So again, that issue of precious versus not precious objects is one that we juxtapose in some ways, a handwork by a young girl and precious silver like the Liberty Bowl. Some of the wallpaper going in. Here's the Spanish Colonial Gallery, another object that's quite unusual. We're very lucky to have here in Boston. It was purchased for the wing, one of the finest pieces of 16th century silver stamped and signed, produced in Guatemala in 1560. We also, of course, have the great works of the new nation. Here, the enormous Sully painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, the portraits of Martha and George that became the standard for so many of the images of George Washington that were propagated during the history of our own nation as it formed its own history. And of course, it's the one that you, if you're carrying around $1 in your pocket, you'll notice the similarities to the image of Washington there. And here it is, the Sully painting going in, and the final look of this gallery, which is very much about the history of this nation as can be told through the objects in the MFA Boston. And we're going to move quickly here through our spine, heading up through level 2 with the work of John Singer Sargent in all media. The old MFA with its entrance on Copley Square, right across from the former building for MIT. They were very close neighbors in those days in their early founding. Here, a tribute in this gallery to how the MFA looked in those galleries on Copley Square, hung in the traditional salon style. Here it is emulated in the new Art of the Americas wing, showing artists on the Grand Tour. And as we went up to level 3, there we felt we could be much more experimental with how we installed these objects, because the artists and makers themselves were. So we included a little tribute to Frederick Kiesler. Here he's installed he's an architect who installed Peggy Guggenheim's gallery in New York City. Here's Pollock looking into a model of an ideal museum that was never realized in 1946. And here, Charles and Ray Ames designing their modular cabinet that became some of the inspiration for our displays in the wing. But I think what we're most proud of at the museum is the fact that we've been able to include a much richer breadth of artists working in the 20th century. Here's Norman Lewis pictured with his painting of 1964. This work was never before seen in public collections. It was purchased by the Dudleys, shown here at right, Ray, an artist, Judge Edward Dudley, the first African-American man to hold elected office in the state of New York. And this painting, I think, really the finest Norman Lewis ever to come to light. We were lucky to get it at auction. Here is MIT's own Ralph Coburn standing in front of his painting. Ralph's in his 90s. Here he is in 1950 when he painted and first exhibited the work. You can see that it's all individual canvases. There are 35 of them. And he intended them to be arranged however one would wish. We chose the first installation to be the way he showed it in 1950, but we do have an interactive touch table that you can go try it yourself and rearrange it however you'd like. Here's 20th century art going in. You saw Paternoster. This is Al Loving, an African-American artist, Cube 27 from 1970. And here are the galleries on that floor as people are walking through them. So whether you cut through the middle, and we call it the high road, this is an image of Paul Clay's painting of 1939, or you take any of the other byroads, we hope that you will find many of the fruits of diversity there at the new Art of the Americas wing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Well, for me, it's fitting that you showed the Paul Klee, the High Road, is one of my favorite paintings. So now I have to come down. It's inspired so many designs that I've worked on. So it's good karma here. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I think, do I just click this one? This one, okay. I'd like to just sort of start out when I was thinking about speaking tonight. it gives me the opportunity to basically for the first time articulate how I got here. And I think I'm the first generation of an African-American architect, landscape architect, planner that actually had the freedom to practice in the way that I could share my experiences with the people who experienced my work. Some of my colleagues who came before me, they had the burden of representing their entire race within the pedagogy of the school as well as the profession. And so I thank them tonight for allowing my fruits, well, my trees to bear fruits, metaphorically, in my work, and allowing me to have the freedom to improvise and to share with you my personal experiences through my built work. I would characterize myself as a designer. Tonight I'd like to share with you work that I've sort of put together over the last decade that deals more with this concept of the mundane. Those objects, those spaces that most of us don't care for, those places we pass by daily, the things that at one time were the structure of communities that are now just left behind. And our work comes out of, I think, the school of thought that the old is just as good as the new. And if you go back and look at early African-American expressions in the cultural and material arts, this idea is very present in that work. Robert Farris Thompson, in his work, talks about improvisation as reshaping the old and familiar into something new. And that resonated with me. Recently, I saw a film on Basquiat, and actually Robert Farris Thompson was describing his work and describing how he was able to take his surroundings and through this sort of process, a very active improvisational process, give us something completely new. I'm not comparing myself to Basquiat, but the kind of process that's available to me was articulated there. I want to show you a lot of images tonight that show the wide realm of expressions within the public realm. What you're looking at here is a parking lot in Macon, Georgia. And Macon, Georgia is probably one of the most polarized neighborhoods between black and white. It has a history of blacks bringing cotton to the middle of the road, taking them out, and whites keeping them subserviated. We want a competition, and what you're looking at are bales of cotton placed with parked cars, placed on top of the old marketplace. So now when people come to the downtown, they actually can sit amongst the cotton bales and actually see the Daughters of the Confederacy obelisk that's sitting juxtaposed to it. We don't have to say anymore. Or a community garden, and instead of this idea of thinking about food, which is, in America we have this predilection of we want to reform people, we want to make them better, and we go back to our agrarian roots. We're more interested in getting people to sort of think about those objects, whether it's water, whether it's how we actually propagate. And this is a garden we did for Curtis Jackson 50 Cents in Bette Midler in New York, where the actual expressions of catching water was much more important because most of these gardens don't have water. And so through the champagne bottles, people can talk amongst themselves, but they can actually understand how water is going into the ground and coming out of the pump, and they can actually cultivate a garden. Or a place like the Oakland Museum. Museums are somewhat static. This was one of the first free museums, I think, in this country, that during the civil rights, it quickly became a paid museum. They found it was way too porous, that people could come in and they couldn't protect the arts. So basically, this museum has laid fallow over the last 30 years and has now gone through an amazing revitalization. We've had the opportunity to work with the director to talk about California and its culture and how people can contribute to this institutional experience. We did a few installations here. The first one is garden ornaments, where Asians and the Spanish were not represented within the museum itself. So we took two canonized gardens, Kyoto and Seville, and we took these large ornaments, turned them upside down, floated them in vitrines, and allowed the light and shadow to create these new gardens. These new gardens now begin to speak about the light, less about the plants, but more about how people can experience these spaces and think about culture in a different way. And they become these amazing playgrounds for children. These vitrines were originally for plants, and the plants, again, were these kind of dead spaces. And now these spaces have been articulated, and now they welcome people into the visitor experience of the museum. Along with that, the museum asked if we could do something a little more active that would involve the staff as well. So a little research, we found that Del Monte had a huge canning operation in West Oakland. And we decided that we would talk about this in a different way. And we decided that we would can spinach and place it in the museum lobby. And the canned spinach became these large pieces of canned spinach, and we wrote "Spinach on the Side by Oakland." And a marvelous thing happened over the weeks that we had the canned spinach. People would come in, they would read "canned spinach." You think that's really spinach? And they would touch it. And this whole idea that through the canning process that you can grow food. And along the way, the various curators actually took over the process of propagating vegetables, and this lasted throughout the summer. And then the bins actually went out into the community, and now canned spinach exists in 5 gardens in West Oakland. But again, this notion of the object has become very important for us because the way we move around in space, we forget a lot about our contacts. We forget the trees. We forget the telephone posts. We forget the hydrants. We forget those things that exist that we pay a lot of money for. And one of our biggest things is how can we begin to empower people to look at their surroundings? Whether you're in California, we have a monsoon in California, meaning it rains during one particular time. It's dry the rest of the year. We bring in water from outside of California. You go to South Carolina, in Charleston, go to Charleston, you can't find the water. You go into the downtown, the water is nowhere. But if it rains for 30 minutes, the water will actually come up out of the ground and the cars will go down the street. So we thought we would get people to see the water. And so we bought 150 IKEA chairs, and we would go out into the community and just place the chairs. And people would say, why are you placing these blue chairs in the landscape? And of course, the landscape led to water. And through that conversation, we learned that this place was built on the hands of African Americans and whites alike. Whites had the seeds, blacks had the actual cultivation skills of controlling the water. So we actually grew rice in a courtyard in a summer over 8 weeks, and then attracted blue herrings and all kinds of other types of wildlife into this place. And then people were able to take the rice home and actually shuck the rice. But it gave them a new connection to this place. And it doesn't take long. Within a week, herrings were flying over. Within a month, there were frogs here. I don't know how they got here, but. In our urban spaces, a typical square in downtown Oakland, most men come to this square to basically tell lies, drink, and sit and wait for work. One image here on the right, 1930, image on the left, 1990. Our mandate was basically, let's keep the old men here, and let's keep that diversity. You can get your hair cut in the bathroom, and you could pay dominoes in the back. And even people who are out of their luck still look the same through this proscenium. Instead of making a center, we actually made edges. So people can be here saying, you know, I got demons in my food, and you can still, you know, sit and have your lunch at the same time. But this notion of getting people to see their surroundings is a very important aspect, I think, in marginal communities because we've forgotten the context. In certain places where infrastructure has come in and actually changed the way people lived, we now have a way of telling them, look what the infrastructure has done. This is in West Oakland as well. This is the BART train that comes through, elevated. It wiped out an entire community. Ron Dellums is from this place. And he said when the train came through, it killed his community. So we put reflective mirrors here so that people could actually see the devastation that was actually happening to their community. And you could actually see the boarded up buildings through the actual BART trains. And along the way, I got my students involved to basically build amenities to get people to think about that history as well. And when you place an object in the public realm, if you do it with a certain density, people will see it and they will use it. We found amazing behavior traces up and down here, and behavior traces are what people leave behind. Right? In a place that didn't have any sort of public amenities. And after a few months, the way people sort of began to participate with the landscape through those behavior traces showed us that people want these types of spaces. At the University of Virginia, we just finished a cultural landscape that was basically hidden from view because Thomas Jefferson had built his mall up above, and this was bottom land. This was basically an area where that was of drainage. Along the way in building the South Lawn, which is an extension of Jefferson's lawn, they actually found a burial grave, a cemetery, and they found a house. And they wondered, who did it belong to? A PhD student did the history, and she found out this was a place called Canada. And Canada was a place where a free black woman actually bought land and actually washed the clothes for the boys at UVA. And construction stopped, and we were hired to try to come up with a way to capture the identity of the woman who lived there and the people who washed the clothes and actually took care of the boys of UVA. Our first impulse was to do something counter to the University of Virginia. If you think about the plantation, if you think about these strong classical landscapes, people who are subserviated try to circumvent those axes. There's been research that even on plantations, people, slaves, didn't walk down the formal alleys. They made their own pathways. And our big design move was we wanted to create spaghetti over Jefferson's axis. And of course, you know, that wouldn't go well. But we were able to sort of carve out a small little area where it became a small homestead next to these neoclassical buildings. And there we were able to talk about the life of this first free black woman and the people who were buried in the cemetery next to it. Now, we don't know who were buried. There were 28 bodies and 7 dogs, I think. But what was interesting was we did the research, and when you're buried in this low country, as the body decomposes, the ground actually settles, and you get this beautiful landform. And so we decided to create this landform in relationship to a shadow and light. And it's a flash of the Spirit. It's a portal for the people who live there to actually make their way to heaven. I'm from the South, and when we would have funerals, when you went to bury someone, you would take the foil and turn the foil back. And the foil actually would allow the light to hit the ground, and the spirit would get a ride to heaven. And so through this sort of consciousness of the dark and the light, we created what we call the shadow catcher. And this was basically the footing of the house raised above that would actually create a sparkle daily and a shadow as well. And this, along with the new buildings, creates a very strange landscape, a landscape where people are able to sort of understand that history, but in a very different way. And hopefully they're moved by that condition. They're moved in a way that's just not didactic to the life of people in the Low Country, but also moved by an experience of light, shadow, and an investigation of a place. As the light moves through, you're able to see the beautiful rock work that the craftsmen did hundreds of years ago, a couple hundred years ago, but you're also able to sort of understand that juxtaposition of a formal landscape and a very domesticated cultural landscape. The shadow catcher is a very modern structure, but the outside is dark and the inside is light. And when the light hits it, you can sort of feel the portal between the sky. And as one of the trustees explained to me, you have to look down and then you look up. And I think he understood what we were trying to do. The cemetery, which is next to it, is basically just a contoured ground that allows the shadow, again, to find its place within the plots. And then the small, narrow, 30-inch pathway that people have to move through the landscape within. And then looking out from the new art school, history school, you can actually see this cultural landscape juxtaposed to this new neoclassical building. And lastly, a project in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania that we've had the opportunity to work on, a 1,000-acre neighborhood right next to downtown, which I didn't know anything about the Hill District. The Hill District was called the Chicago of the East at one point in time. Evidently, you could take a train from New York through Chicago, end up New York, Pennsylvania, Chicago. And it was one of the places to be. Lena Horne, fantastic musicians. But like a lot of urban areas that were populated by immigrants by the mid-century, it was wiped clean. It was wiped clean for a new hockey arena and stadium. And the people of the Hill have been trying to rebuild their community. One of the fantastic things about the Hill, on the left, it has the highest biomass than Schley Park, Frick Park, and any of the larger 19th century suburbs. But we look at these places as empty, disinvested places. We went in and we said, there's a lot here. There are turkeys, there are deer, rabbit, and someone explained, I have a rural lifestyle and I can see the city. And it made me think, people were thinking about this 100 years ago. How can we buttress this idea? We presented to them that they can have a wood and a village within what we call a disinvested landscape. And so over a year, working with the community, building this idea, cleaning the place, just cleaning it off, not doing any interventions, we established a new village and a wood. We hung a banister over the Hill Street Blues police station, number 2, had a big barbecue, and then we presented this at the Venice Biennale in Italy. So go figure. We could have the hill actually be in Europe and being celebrated for all of its objects and all of its life that exists. And none of these things are new. They're all built on that cultural landscape. And we basically looked at August Wilson as the person who took the hill around the world with him. He always presented the hill as a backdrop in his plays. And so this idea of the proscenium of the street life was basically our idea for the work. And along the way, we were asked to design this little red spot here. That's the stadium, the Mellon Arena, that wiped out the hill. And this little red place was supposed to deal with the ghost of the past and heal people's memories. And we basically came up with a simple idea that there would be a series of gardens that would help the arena get its leads points so that it would be a green place. But there was an art piece that they wanted to somehow commemorate the community that was wiped out. So we basically built a series of rain gardens that go down the hill with all the nice plants and everything. And then we brought people into the place. And we asked people, anyone in the city who had any history in the hill, to give us images. And we wanted to collect 7,000 images over the summer to bring a curtain call back to this new arena. And when we would do that, we would create these 20-foot-high curtains and drape the west side of the arena so that people could come back into this garden and actually find themselves in the place that had been scraped clean. And this rain garden was seen as a functional element that's part of this new ecology. And we wanted to layer in it that kind of history, the mundane within that. And so the last piece that we added to it was, how could we talk about this being a rain garden and it being something very important to the people in that history. And so when you go into the rain garden, you guys can start this now, you will actually trigger sound. And we've collected about 50 rain songs, rhythm and blues songs. And so as you walk through, you'll actually hear African Americans singing about rain as they're looking at this flora. That's very abstract to them. And for us, it's this marriage between this kind of, this cultural get-side, that you have this sort of new aesthetic and these old and familiar voices looking at you as you experience this. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for...
Mr. Boliasco.
Absolutely.
Fruits of diversity. I was thinking that in many ways, and there's lots of themes between us here, improvisation, transformation, how our perspective of having other cultures in our upbringing or experience, of course, gives us new ways of looking at something that is old and making it new. I like to share that my parents, my mother, who passed recently, but she was Panamanian. She came from Panama, came here to go to Boston University when she was 18 and met my father, who was an American Jew. And this is the 1950s. There is some fruits of diversity right there. And 4 beautiful children they had. I'm the eldest. And just navigating that as an Afro-American with a white Jewish father, with a Panamanian mother who brought up in a very British type, I mean, she had to learn how to integrate herself in Afro-American culture, because many of the Afro-Americans here, and she worked in the school system here in Boston, would say, you can drop that King's English now, just get real. She said, I am real. The music that was in the house, my father very much, he became an acoustic physicist, but both my parents loved music. My mother played a little violin, my father played clarinet and composed some. I'm about 6 years old, and I remember these albums, remember albums? Bach, cantatas. I said, oh, I like that music. Igor Stravinsky, great Russian contemporary composer. The 3 ballets, The Rite of Spring, Firebird, Petrushka. So at 6 or 7, I'm listening to this music. Miles Davis, Birth of Cool, and Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker. How did all those musics work? Well, as a young child, I just thought, these are all exciting to me. They all work, they inspire me, and I didn't know categories. Of course, as you go into the institutionalized learning curve, then you're asked to make choices. Well, you're a pianist. Are you going to be a classical pianist? Are you going to be a jazz pianist? I said, excuse me? I do both. You can't do both. So Fruits of Diversity is about maintaining your identity, which is all these different things. And it's not letting go of any one of them. It takes a long time to sort of, it's a matter of, it's some courage to do that in face of a lot of pressure to make choices. So this angle of combining jazz and classical music, you can see, started from, which is what I do. It's integrated in just who I am as a person. And I'd like to just show you, we can put on the screen a Bach invention, the Bach invention in D minor. There we go. How many of you play, most people take piano lessons when they're very young, right? You've played through the Bach inventions or, so, if you don't mind, I'll step down here. And I remember learning this invention, I was about 6 or 7 years of age, and the standard way when you're with a piano teacher to learn to play the classical pianos, sort of even rhythm, touch, and so forth. And occasionally I would, because I was hearing all this other music, I'd come in and go, add these different articulations. No! Legato touch. Now, I wrote a piece which you'll hear, and actually I'll have my collaborators, great musicians, and by the way, fitting of this theme, the 2 musicians that are going to join me, my partners, we've played a lot throughout the world, Daphnis Pietto, who's from Cuba, and John Lockwood, who plays bass, who's from South Africa originally, and came here to study at Berklee College of Music. So there's a connection there, the diversity within making music. There's a piece I wrote called Inventions in Blue, because this piece, this little invention, I remember playing it at the recital, 7 years of age, and I had a memory slip. One of those things where you, whoop, and part of me wanted to just go ahead and make up some music, and the other part was to be correct with it. And that moment taught me to follow my gut about improvisation and how that can lead to new frontiers. So later, when I was doing this project, Monk and Bach, and exploring Bach in depth, this piece really came to mind of, can I transform that experience I had as a child, that dread of being on stage and having the memory slip and falling through the black hole, making it something that is new from old, and confronting all those different pressures about where do you fit in, what category are you in. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how I transform that music. You don't have to be a musician to understand this. I think you'll see, and the different elements that come into play in working with diversity. That is Afro-Cuban, which is what Daphnis brings to the element, how rhythm works in most musics and cultures in the world, percussion is very important. In European cultures, the percussion instruments are in the background. If you think of a symphony orchestra, it's primarily strings and brass and winds, and you have the kettle drums, but you don't have the percussion up front. And if you think of concert halls, they're designed to amplify string instruments and amplify European instruments. So when you bring in percussion, there's a tendency for that sound to get overwhelming. So you might know at Jazz at Lincoln Center, they actually designed a hall that showcased music, jazz music, or music where percussion is in the foreground. So most world music, percussion's a factor. There's a lot of call and response, a lot of interchange, dialogue that goes on in music making. A lot of other elements that are part of the various cultures and the languages that are used. If you think of the rhythm of a lot of music, it's related to the languages that are spoken in the culture. So back to our invention. We'll go back to the Bach invention, please. So I'll show you some transformation. So we have the first theme. Which in itself, Bach is really amazing how he's just manipulating that little phrase, that motive. But if you just take the Bach, now we'll do the transformation of space, sort of like in architecture. We're going to move this musical theme into the bass. We're going to speed it up a little bit. Now add some rhythm to it. That's how the Inventions in Blue starts. There it is, transformed. It's now becoming something that I want to manipulate. There are elements in the harmony of this piece that you wouldn't hear it if you're playing the piece. But there's some harmonic tension that actually there's a blues in there. Do you believe me? There's a blues in there, which I think when I have the band, you'll hear it more clearly. Those harmonies are embedded in the Bach. And J.S. Bach knew they were there. He emailed me, told me where to find them. So let's make this really live. Let's bring out my friends, collaborators. John Lockwood on double bass. Daphne Pietro. And show how this transformation continues. And you can put the Inventions in Blue chart. Now these, for those who know about music, these are road maps, lead sheets. They're sort of, the musicians have them to know where we begin, where we go into the middle, where we go to the end. But there's lots of room for improvisation, where things happen just at the moment, just as we'll have when we have our dialogue on the table. We don't really know what we're going to say to each other, and there'll be themes, and we're going to toss them back and forth. And that's what happens musically here. That opening transformation that I showed you in the bass, I'm going to do that, and then John's going to play with me, and then Daphne and I are going to have a conversation musically, where he's going to do certain rhythms in the drums, and I'm going to toss them back to him, he's going to toss them back to me. And see if you can follow that. It's like we have a little ball, and we're going to throw it, and he catches it. And the game is, as I throw it to him, not only does he has to catch it and not let it drop, he throws it back to me and then puts in another rhythm. And you try to go increase this sort of tension and hope that none of you fall or drop the ball. And that's the fun of it. follow that? Yeah, yeah. That was on that little motive of the Bach. There's another place in the Bach, in the original invention, that goes like this. And it's a little sub-theme right at the end. I'm trying to find it now where it is exactly. That's it. That's the Bach. Now watch, I take that and change the rhythmical envelope. And here's what it sounds with just the piano. We're breaking up, we're sort of fragmenting that motive. Now let's put the band together on that and watch how that works. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. That's the blues. And I think you can see how we're communicating, right? There's a sense of start smiling and we're throwing things back and forth. And so if you came to a concert or you come to a club, which is a very intimate thing, there's a whole connection that happens between the musicians and the audience of being sort of inside the moment and inside how the music's created. So that's one example of space transformation through sound, which is a form of architecture and design. There are lots of other examples. Why don't we do a little bit of a tango? This sort of came out of me playing this piece. How are you going to get a tango out of that? Oblivion. that piece goes on to another dimension, but yeah. So I think we'll exchange on the panel sort of our connections, and we can come back to some examples. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to make sense of all of this, but anyway.
It's beautiful. I love the tango.
So, I mean, I think there's some obvious themes that have been permeating this conversation. Obviously, the whole question of improvisation leading to new frontiers, which is something that certainly links the two of you, but I can also, I don't know, it was in your case not improvisation, but the whole question of one thing that's in common, you can tell multiple stories simultaneously, which I think really is a key. And that's very much the work that took place in the museum. And that's all by simply finding different ways to release categories that were old and tired and not very useful. So I think the fact that you released the display of divided by media, which had never struck me, but it's absolutely true. There's rooms in which, get terribly boring, but when you start to juxtapose, there's a whole different new meaning. And I think you could say that, actually, I think this sort of relates to all of the work. You're saying, I'm not going to be bounded by certain conventions, and Walter's saying the same thing, let's just look at this thing in a different way. The park doesn't have to have a center, it can have edges. So, we just rethink all the rules that we've been kind of brought up to imagine, actually. And the more we're able to do this, in a way, cross-fertilization, the richer the whole story becomes, And so, of course, we've got parallel stories to tell that you two have, and I think I do with you too. So who would like to take this on?
You'd like me to comment, Adèle, on some of our connections? I mean,
surely.
I thought, just listening recently, how much we each had a great respect for history in many ways. I mean, listening to obviously your training, but also your great research on the last the University of Virginia project is the one I'm particularly thinking of. We had the same issues in the museum, but of course, how do you layer on or make new? I mean, I think that is where I see a very strong thread in all of what we're doing, in a sense, because we are what we are. We're an institution founded in 1870, so certain objects are coming down to us, but we have to catch up in so many areas that in a decade it's just not possible. Right. So when I think of improvisation, I think of many collections committees that of course are closed. We can't speak about it publicly, but we have to improvise ways around why we acquire things when certain people are very clear about things that are, quote, worthy of the art museum. So it's always a pushing of the boundary. And then when there's a critical mass, then people suddenly get it and you can move from that platform to a new platform. Right. But I was just thinking a little bit on the history underlying.
No, I mean, that's one of the things that I guess for me, it not until graduate school and listening to Spiro Kostoff, this fantastic architectural historian, bring history to light to a certain degree, and that you see that, in modernism from designs as if everything's new, right? And, there's no history, let's start fresh. And then you start to see these fragments that, someone else was thinking in the same way, but they were just different and coming from a different place. I had the opportunity back in early 90s to take a class with Grover Sales out of Stanford, who was a roadie for Miles. Okay. And he would, it was one of these jazz listening classes to listen. It was very similar to you teaching here, so I just went back 20 years. But it was the same kind of thing. He would say, he would share with us some classical music, and then he would play Parker. Yeah. Or he would play others, and he would say, there's the same thing. Right. He's just coming at it a different way, and all these things start to kind of build, and then for me, I have this amazing respect for history then, right? This sort of reverence for it, and a way to sort of think about the tradition in which you're working, as if it's architecture, landscape architecture, art, that you have this respect, and there is this kind of, that you're part of this long movement, which in a way is this beautiful music, if you can make those connections. And I think from a visceral point of view, you know, you're in the club playing, people are responding. For me in space, I'm always blown away by someone coming into one of our spaces and finding a place.
Yeah.
Something that I never thought about, like that hill in Lafayette Square. People started drying their clothes on it, or kids playing football on it, or the policeman driving his motorcycle up at the top to survey. But just this kind of notion that I'm thinking in this very formal way, right? Thinking about the sphere, thinking about being able to make a circle and the circle not having edges and you can constantly move around, and if you bring it up this height, people will always have green. I mean, these are very picturesque and classical ideas that comes from French gardens and English gardens. And, you know, in a way, people start to sort of, you know, get that, and you get this beautiful music that comes out of that.
Exactly. I think in order to create something new, you really do have to respect what came before you. You have to know your history. And the idea that you can just come out and just create something out of the blue, I mean, I don't know when that has really happened in history. There's been a value that we really want to retain it. Maybe some rare cases, but it's always some connection to the past and learning from that and then moving forward. The trick is how to let go.
Let go, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And innovate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And allow the transformation to take
Yeah.
place freely, actually,
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you spoke about this courage. It's really scary. I mean, you know, to have the courage to not get pigeonholed by it, to say what you think about something and stay with the convictions, because for a lot of people it is new.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it is new and it's scary, you know, because it's fragmenting maybe a kind of a collective consciousness that is holding on to something. I mean, in our Macon project, you know, they wanted a classical street. You know, it's Middle Georgia, you know, and then we brought in, I remember the paper, this new modern thing, you know, and the mayor was like, why are you not planting those trees in a long row like this? But they were afraid that all of a sudden people might find new ways into something very old. And so, but it was, I'm always, how can I say, now I'm a little better at it, but in the beginning of the work, you know, really going home at night, not sleeping, you know, and like really fretting about it. But it does take a kind of a courage to push.
The thing is, even though when we're innovating and we're trying to move forward, we want to be accepted.
Yes.
And taken, I mean, there's a part of us that's actually conservative in that way. You know, the idea that you could be completely on the realm and not care about any of your peers' opinions and things is pretty unusual. So that's the tug of war of how much to take from the past and the people you respect, and then to move to that frontier where they're going to go, no, you can't go there, and you say, yes, I can.
I think institutionally, I mean, that's
Yeah.
something when you're talking about a committee or an outside group having a concept, I think also with a museum that's used by so many people. But I think to shift a bit onto the improvisation, I do think fundamental to the whole concept of, is there a culture of the Americas? Or if you want to think of the art of our nation, it's been so much about, I mean, the way I see it, and I think our whole team in the book that we worked on, the A New World Imagined, it was all about looking at the works of art from the point of view as much as we could if they were artists we knew something about or that we didn't, looking at all the strands that were brought into those works of art, just as you're doing with the music or the architecture, because there were many ways that these artists innovated and elaborated and using what they had available to them in so many really unbelievably creative ways. And I do think if we achieved anything in this wing, it was to try to express that great breadth of the ways people derive inspiration from so many cultures around the globe, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but really across time and space. And what that, there is many forms of human expression as there are works of, I mean, the works of art are infinite, so we can have all sorts of human expression represented.
Was there a committee? How did you make the decisions of what to pick and not?
Yeah, and what to put together.
We had 10 curators in our department, and we had other curators in other departments, and we had conservators and educators and designers. So we had a large group of people, and we had lots of people we presented to in fora like these, in smaller groups or bigger groups, and it's probably not so different than developing a building. You just want to be sure you get a project that ends up being the horse that is not the camel designed by the committee. Because I think there is that real risk when you're working on a project that large.
I was just wondering, what, in all of your cases, what about user response? You know, you had a user response. I mean, you know, you have an agenda, you've changed the paradigms, you know, how do people respond to it? And, Walter, you found unexpected behavior, certain things you did expecting X and Y, and then you talked about Lafayette Park, and you too, actually, in a way, because, this is pretty complex stuff you showed us, but it has to resonate. People really have to understand where it's going. So does anybody want to talk about that?
We have a live blog that people are welcome to respond anytime, and we take all sorts of comments. But I would say throughout the process, our education department went out and interviewed people who were willing to talk to us in the galleries, and we did solicit lots of advice as well. But we wanted to try to understand how people use spaces, ones that were existing. But then as we were creating them, we would also try them out. We had a chance between 2001 and 2003 to reinstall galleries that have now been dismantled. And then we took on a lot of comment books and different ways of soliciting
so
what
you
was
actually,
getting through and what
you kind
wasn't.
of test marketed,
yes,
if you will.
in a way.
Yeah,
It was on a same track along with the planning for the wing. So we reinstalled about 14 galleries, and they were really like small labs that we could try ideas out.
Yeah, I mean, you have a large public that you have to, you have to have a vision for the museum, but then something that doesn't really alienate the museum lover and goer. So you have to sort of cross about. As an individual artist, this is an interesting thing where you can just do your own thing and say, I don't care what the audience thinks.
Right.
There's some, or I'm in sort of the place where I have to be true to what I'm thinking, but I do want to communicate. I do want to touch the listener. Even like you said, it may be complicated, but that on the surface there's something that connects and resonates with the listener. And I think when we're playing, we know that feeling in the room, if you're giving a concert, where there's a sense of the audience becomes totally part of you as an organism. It's organic, and the energy's flowing between you and the stage and the audience. And that can happen in speaking or in other dimensions. Yeah.
No, I mean, what's beautiful about when you're playing, it's, if I can hear, it's what's familiar to you, and at least what I take on. If I'm into blues and I'm listening to your music, I can find the blues. And then you can just give me this other thing, and before I know it, I got this other thing, and I didn't even know it. And to me, that's the hook. Right. And that's when I started out with the familiar, that you can make people feel at ease by giving them something that's very familiar. And for me, this is the big critique of kind of my modernist education, where we were making things that just didn't resonate with anyone. There was not a starting point. And when you were playing the last piece you were playing, dum dum. Dun, 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 dun. That's the hook. I'm in there, man. And then you can just take me anywhere. And for me, it's like in every design, that's what I'm trying to do, because in public space, you don't know where people are coming from. Right. And there's no way, I don't buy into the behaviorist theory that you can actually get the user group and figure out how to make everyone happy. There's always going to be someone coming in that's like, that's the most awful thing in the world. Yeah. But if you can give them a way in, to me, they can sort of make their own decisions about it. And I see that in the museum as well. You're bringing in this kind of contemporary work with the historic work, and people might have an affinity one way or another, and hopefully they're going to come out with a completely different understanding of this mixture, and I think you've done your job. To me, for me, it's not about getting the blessing, but it's about, can I find that connection and then allow people to find their way within that.
Find their own connection, find their own creative connection.
For us, it's looking. I think for you, it's listening. Probably for you, it's experience. For us, it's experience. But we can't get people to look, at least for the average person spends fewer than 30 seconds looking at any object. So just to get your attention for a couple of seconds is something that we have to do first before. It's like pulling you in with the music or pulling you in with the space. If we can't pull you in with the looking aspect, we can't even begin to tell you about how unbelievably creative these artists are and what they're doing. So we have to stop you in your tracks.
Right.
And I used to spend a lot of time in the Met in my time between my office looking at where people would go, just out of curiosity, what would stop them? Because our offices were at the top of the Great Stairs on the way to Impressionism. So we had to put something very compelling out in that space to divert people from their path to, French Impressionism.
Right.
So it would just be very curious. I just found that I just like to watch what people, and even in the wing, I like to watch what's causing people to stop and look.
And what's causing them to stop? What's some
all
of the things?
kinds of, I mean, it depends who they are, old, young, I mean, but I'm just curious.
Young people, what's the big draw for them?
All throughout, I mean, a lot of young people watching the shark is always a great draw. It's got a lot of drama. But other objects that are unexpected, I mean, the Cesar Paternoster resonates with lots and lots of people. It's, of course, been all over the city on the banners. But I think it's fascinating to see a work that's totally new to the Boston community feel that a lot of people have a way into a work that. So then you start wondering, well, what did he get in that? That I mean, I love that piece, but also it obviously has a connection to a lot of people. So.
Well, you have the most difficult task, to tell you the truth, because it's very, if it's 30 seconds, and each thing is so full of detail, and it's got so much history and such a story. 30 seconds. Fewer, right.
I mean, not even some of them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and yours, of course, people go and experience it in different ways in different seasons, and you know, any landscape evolves. You know, you've actually got something there that hopefully people go back to again and again and again. They have to be intrigued. And, you know, music evaporates, you hear it and it evaporates. So, but it can also be so compelling, people go and get the recordings and they say it again, and then they possess it in their own ways, you know. So I think maybe, are there questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah. Let's try this. Yes, whoever you are, I can't see you.
Oh, there's one.
Yeah. This is good, thank you.
That's fantastic.
Lots of questions, but
Yeah, let's get that on.
It's on now, I think.
Okay. Wonderful presentations. Thank you very much. I have lots of questions, but I'll try to boil it down to one particular one in the theme. In all your presentations, there's two types of viewers. There's a viewer that instantly looks at the item, but then there may be opportunities to explain why you did what you did. Like, why is the design designed this way? And then the person will have greater appreciation. And so there's a balance of trying to have viewers or listeners enjoy what you're having. And I just guess the question is how do you balance that? I mean, sometimes you may see a picture, you may not like it at all, but then you read why the artist did what he or she did, and you grow an appreciation for it because of what the reasoning or the meaning was. The same thing with landscape. Like in Macon, you could just see that and you have no idea what those white things are until you see the history and what the intention was, and then you have a greater appreciation. The same way of balancing box. So the question is how do you balance that? Do you have, like in the case of the landscape, do you have a plaque that indicates what you did in terms of the museum? Do you you have the listing items that people can follow, but in jazz, it's sometimes difficult in concerts to talk about that. So I just want you to expand upon that.
Okay, who'll go for that?
Well, that's one of the most difficult things for me because I would rather not be overly didactic about my work. I mean, if I could make work and not have a sign underneath it, that would please me all the most. But I know some sites, some places like the piece at University of Virginia, the story needed to be told. The story is actually told inside the building as well as in the landscape. The signage, the didactic aspect is done, I think, very well. It's a marvelous designer who was very sensitive to allowing the visitor to have an experience separate of a plaque. But it's a very hard thing to do. I think, in projects that we've had in the Lafayette Square Park, the Old Man's Park, that hill is inspired by an observatory. It was one of the first observatories in the city was placed in that space. It inspired the circle. Now the observatory is up in the hill. I didn't want to tell the story.
That's fascinating.
Because to me it was just a connection that I made. About 10 years later, an artist came in and wanted to tell the story. And they actually then made a plaque and talked about the observatory. And then people started to talk about it in a completely different way. So I can see, sometimes it's a good thing to do, but for me, I would rather people not focus on my inspiration more, but to sort of try to experience the resultant of my inspiration. And again, I think it's a very kind of selfish thing from an artistic point of view, but I understand some of the larger stories need to be told because they actually have value not within the space, but in society at large and within the culture at large. So.
Yeah. Oh, I think if, say, I go to a museum,
Yeah.
I like to take my 30 seconds, hopefully 60 seconds,
We're going to follow you around, okay?
view, and then later go back to the curator's tape to get that sort of history and perspective. So I want to have my own sensibility of what's going on, and then I want to have more information. So the combination, I think, is good. And music appreciation, you know, you can have a whole discussion about a Beethoven symphony that's very cerebral, but I'd want before that lecture, for the listener to experience it at a visceral level first.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, sorry, just a second, but I mean, there's always different interpretations. And actually, I think I love the idea you make the connections. You might have told the story in UVA, but they wouldn't, there's the ways in which you interpret, say, the graves, for example.
Right.
You know, that just looks like a beautiful artifact. And then you go, oh my God, I understand, you know.
Yeah.
But it's more interesting to discover it yourself than be told. And I think in the museum, you know, because you've got such an amazingly different audience that comes, they're going to resonate in different ways with different things, you know. I mean, you know, I loved the basement, by the way. And I loved the basement because I loved the artifacts themselves, but they were so surprising to me. And there I took more than 30 seconds, believe me, because I kept on going back in there and saying, wow, this is incredible stuff, you know. So, but you're going to say
but
something.
we have to really think about the layering. I like to think of it as multivalent, and I think we felt that the museum opening a new wing, the information should also be fairly innovative. So in addition to the traditional text panels labels, of which there's 6,500 labels in there, we have a smartphone geared for adults and children. We have the new website. We had a traditional a book, I mean a regular book, but looking at things in a different way. And then we have these interactive touch tables throughout the wing, and we have 4 galleries that are also pilots. All of these things are pilots. We're still evaluating, and we do embed spyware to find out how deeply into these programs people are going. But the 4 behind-the-scenes galleries were intended to do what you're asking about. How do you make these decisions? And that was the theme that kept coming back again and again in all the groups. People wanted to know how we made the decisions, how the work gets done. You know, in a way, watching you all practice or put this together as you did, that's what those screens are really telling, how we go about putting a gallery together from every step of the way. And so that's what you'll see in there if you spend some time in those galleries and take a little time to work your way through those. And they're meant to evolve as time goes on.
Well, one comment. I miss album covers.
Oh.
You know, because you could...
What is that, sorry?
Album covers.
I mean, you could get the music, listen, and you could just have this intimate experience with it. And I just remember reading all of Parliament Funkadelic stuff, right? And then Kind of Blue, you know, you could just sit there, listen to the music, and have... It felt like a personal relationship. Maybe
That's
I'm just
true.
nostalgic.
No, I agree. I mean, now it's the iPod and iTunes,
Right.
and the kids download. They don't even know who's playing
Right.
the title of the piece or anything.
Another question from the audience.
Thank you for this terrific night. Professor Fox, I just wanted to perhaps ask what your thoughts of your music. It reminded me of the Tamba Trio from Brazil, and reminded me the jazz that Astor Piazzolla produced.
Yes.
And nowadays, you can hardly find anything of those. I mean, it's like an archaeological expedition. Now, I came from Brazil, and this music comes from Brazil, from Argentina. And my question to you is it the diaspora from Africa, from expatriates from different situations of either poverty or religious or ethnic persecution in Europe that brought all this baggage to the new world, and have these new generations reformulated that and build these new rooms that we would say in landscape architecture, in which we can see this music that came, and it's beautiful, and it's this tradition. But we have our pains. We have all this sometimes anguish or happiness, or that we translate in a different manner. And therefore, all this rhythm, it's pulsating, it's different. So I thank you enormously. And I don't know, am I too far out?
No, well, definitely if we follow the path of migration, Africans, the slave trade, and where the Africans were brought in the different parts of the world, you see how this changed. I mean, I think Daphnis could talk about Cuba better than I can, Afro-Cuban connections. And so I'm not sure if that's addressing just how the different cultures disseminated through, I mean, this tragic event of slavery, and yet the positive energy of the culture and the people to maintain, like in Congo Square in Louisiana, and they still played the drums in the middle of all that disastrous situation. That sense of hope, I mean, that's a beautiful thing about art. Art always, you think about any time in Afghanistan, when they had the first sense of freedom from the Taliban, the first thing they did, everybody sang in the streets. You always find that in some sense of liberation throughout the world is music comes the first thing that people want to communicate with each other. Something very pure about it, and dealing with all the different tragedies and emotions that we deal with. Does that address what you're?
Yes, I mean, you certainly could have gone anywhere in Latin America, and all the way to the mid-'60s, perhaps early '70s, and that's the music. You go to a club, to a dive somewhere, and it's people playing music, and that's what they're playing. And then with all the dictatorships in it, it's tremendous change. But to me, that was, let's say, our culture, our American culture, Latin American culture. And that was sort of almost a continuous thread that I felt from south and north with an enormous connection, which is, with jazz, with that kind of elaboration, musical elaboration. But I don't see it very much, and it's hard to find it. And so I wonder, is this room closed? Is a labyrinthine situation in which, where do we go to find it? It's being almost like one being lost in itself, because it's a culture that
Could you
is not
just
there.
bring this to a close, because I want to see if there's another person in the audience who would like to ask a question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I listen with amazement and joy in all this discussion. I would like to raise a question with you about the relationship between the inspiration, the idea, and the tools that are available. When Donal played Bach, it was with a certain set of instruments and possibilities in mind. And then I looked at this marvelous set of percussions, and I was wondering what Bach would have done if he had access to that kind of instrumentations. So what do you think the mutual relationship is between the tools and the inspiration?
Okay, so
Yeah.
you're on, all right.
Yeah. Well, Daphnis, when you started playing drums, what were the what was it?
Well, for me, actually, let me just the way I see instruments is just the way the name of it says it by itself. This is just an instrument. Are just tools. Imagination doesn't really stop here. I can be thinking on any kind of sounds, and what you could be hearing is a completely range of sounds completely different from the ones that actually I'm intending to do. Okay, so that's where I would say that it comes in my imagination and your imagination as a receiver of that sound. But I would say that for me the goal is that when I imagine something and use the tool, which is the instrument in this case, that you receive the same information I'm trying to contribute to this instrument itself. Like the imagination that I put in, if I try to play, let's say, with a certain quality that I want to have some kind of sound like the timpani. kind of sound or any other kind of sound like violins or any kind of imaginative thought that I have. For me, the goal is that you actually get that sensibility with me at the same time. And the beauty of it is that after you have that experience, I can receive that you understand what I'm trying to say, but not in a very predictive way. Not in the way that I can actually categorize it to you. Oh yes, that was this, that was that. But for me, the enjoyable part is the journey. It's the journey of my imagination using the tool through your imagination.
Yeah.
That's my personal way of seeing it.
I'd agree that the tools, the instruments, I happen to play the piano, Jan happens to play bass, but it's really the concept, the vision, the imagination we have that transforms it. It could be, and Bach, the reason his music works so well now in this transformation is because he had a vision, a concept that was beyond his harpsichord and his organ. Yeah, that it lasts, no matter what the instrumental or tools that change in each generation, it's still, the essence of its structure and infrastructure is intact. So.
Great. Well, I think we're sort of at the end. One more question? Anybody? Here's one. Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for this inspiring evening. Actually, I've got a question to Walter Hood. I liked a lot your project and the work you showed us. And we talked about the journey. I think this design is also always a journey. And thinking about the project with the IKEA chairs, the blue one, I was asking myself, who was the client for this? And how was the journey? What was the journey from the beginning of the project that you did this? Because there would be many ways to do it, I think. And what impact did it have on the community?
It's a good, the IKEA chairs, another artist and myself, Ernesto Pujo, who is a photographer, we basically landed in Charleston, and we didn't know anyone in Charleston. And we were invited to the Spoleto Art Festival. And they invite artists to come in and make work. And we were aware that a decade before, Mary Jane Jacobs, this well-known curator, had brought in these world-class artists, made amazing work, and the community critiqued it as if these aliens came in and basically fed off of them and then left. The work was fantastic, but it didn't involve the kind of local culture, and people felt almost betrayed to a certain degree. And so she came back, Mary Jane actually came back a decade later, and she invited artists who were from the South. I'm from North Carolina, Ernesto was from South Carolina, and others. And so we were very aware that, we had to find ourselves in this landscape. And one day we were out, and, we're just walking around, and it's like, God, this is a vacuous place. We need to talk to people. And it's really hard. I don't know if you go to a place. It's really hard to just come up to someone and go, what do you think? And they go, who are you, right? So we asked Mary Jane to buy us 150 IKEA chairs. She's like, why? We're just like, we don't know, but we put them in a van, and we just went driving towards water. And once we found water, we basically started stacking the chairs leading to water. And we were interested in people living close to water that did have no access to it. And as soon as you would line up 10 chairs, there'd be like 30 people out first looking out of their window. Who are these people doing the chairs? And before you know it, you started just meeting people. And we built this amazing engagement, and we found the most marvelous stories about the first African-American shrimp boat queen, who was actually published in Ebony in the 60s. She actually went to Ghana and taught shrimping. And we found this in an old shrimp hut. People saw us placing those chairs on this old dilapidated thing. This young kid comes out. What are you guys doing? We're mapping, we're putting chairs. You should meet my blah, 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 so they're basically these points of triangulation. So that's why we did it.
Fantastic. Well, that's a nice note to end on. Thank you, my speakers, fellow speakers.